yesterday and said, would you be willing to do this? And at first I was like, I'm so tired because I had been up since 2 o'clock in the morning yesterday. And then I texted her back. I said, yes, because it's important. And one of the third goals of Peace Corps is sharing what we know about the host country, in that case, Ukraine, with people in America. So I texted some friends. I said I was third goaling hard today by sharing all of this with you. And once a Peace Corps volunteer, always a Peace Corps volunteer. It doesn't matter that it's been more than a decade, which is hard to say, by the way. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. If I do have that privilege. Thank you, Lindsay.
Oh, we're having students.
Yes, I believe there are students here as well. Welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. I told Lindsay I was happy to, anybody who wants to know, I'm happy to share my experience and my knowledge. So.
And we are recording this as well.
Great. So if there's any questions, just let me know. When you're sharing the screen, it's kind of hard to see what's going on. So if I definitely will ask you if there's any questions at the end, of course, in typical teacher style, but if there's anything that comes up during the presentation that you want more clarification on, please feel free to ask me. So for those who have not met me personally, my name is Jessica Strickland. I served as a Peace Corps volunteer from September 2009 until November 2011. Ukraine was actually my second country I served in. I previously had served in the Philippines, although my tenure there was cut short. But I did get to serve my full 2.5 years in Ukraine. I was a TEFL volunteer, so I taught English as a foreign language. And it should be noted that Peace Corps is a United States organization that invites America to come to its country to meet specific needs that the country has. So all of the Peace Corps countries, that do you guys mind if you mute yourselves? That would be awesome. Anyway, so all of the Peace Corps countries have invited America to be a part of so that they're all part of the organization. Peace Corps doesn't just like invade, I promise. And when I was there, Ukraine had the most amount of volunteers than any other Eastern European country. There were 500 of us. It was amazing. It was kind of seemed like an invasion, but we were all invited and we were welcome to be there. And as I go through this, I'm going to point out that each Peace Corps volunteer had very different experiences when we were in Ukraine, because Ukraine has a lot of political history, and that's one of the things I'm going to talk about today. Okay. Oh, and in the flyer, it does talk about that I was the Volunteer Action Council President from my last year as a volunteer, which meant that I represented all 500 volunteers. And I was like the liaison between the volunteers and Peace Corps Ukraine. So it meant a lot of trips to Kiev, and it was a 16-hour train ride from my site. So one of my friends actually calculated that I spent 32 days of my life in that 2.5 years on trains. And I told him I could have gone my whole life without realizing that. So I'd like to talk about the people of Ukraine. So I don't know how to move these. So I lived in Stahanov in Lugansk Oblast, which is in the very far east. Everyone spoke Russian. The only people who spoke English were my students. It was my first time teaching college. I was able to teach future English teachers. So they had been studying English for a while. So I was teaching them basically how to teach English as a foreign language. And it was an incredible experience. And because of our closeness in age and the fact that I didn't have anybody else to talk to, my students quickly became my very good friends. And while I taught at the college, and my site mate, which was another Peace Corps volunteer, it was very rare to have 2 Peace Corps volunteers in the same place. It kind of depended upon the size, and Stahanov at the time that I lived there was about 100,000 people in population. So another volunteer, he worked at the secondary school. And so he ran an English club and I would co-teach it with him. And I ran an English club and he would co-teach it with me. And we had a citywide English club so that anybody from the city could come. And that was at the public library. And that was pretty phenomenal. So I did get to spend a lot of time with various people in Stahanov. And I feel like Stahanov is that was my home. Since, like I said, no one spoke English or Ukrainian. So Ukrainian was a language that was only used for official meetings. And every year we had to have, the teachers had to go to this in-service, which I know we can all relate to. And the in-service had to be conducted in Ukrainian. And of course that was really boring for me since I couldn't contribute or understand anything. And I remember sitting there and as the day would go on, I started to understand more. And I was like, wow, my Ukrainian's getting better. No, it turns out they had all gone back to speaking in Russian because speaking Ukrainian for them was really, really hard as well. Ukrainian is the national language of Ukraine, but everybody in the east, on the eastern border of Russia, speaks Russian. We celebrate Russian holidays. In fact, one of the strangest moments for me was when you ask, I started to know that I needed to ask people, do you identify as Ukrainian or Russian? And they would tell me. And so many people, there were many people who did identify as Ukrainian, but there were so many people who identified as Russian. And that always seemed really odd to me. And I would say, well, where were you born? And they would say, Stahanov, here. And I was like, in Ukraine. And they're like, yes, but it's not really Ukraine, it's Russia. And keep in mind that this was in, 2010, 2011. And I was hearing this at that time when Lugansk was definitely part of Ukraine, at least when it came to borders, but mentally it was not. So I had a very different experience in Peace Corps than anybody, than other volunteers that may have been on the west side of the country. In fact, when I traveled to the west side of the country at the end of my service, I went with 2 other volunteers. We all had to go for our close of service meeting with Peace Corps, and no one would speak to me. Once I started speaking Russian, the Ukrainians would stop talking to me and obviously were very uncomfortable. I would try to speak English with them, but nobody spoke English. So I just couldn't talk to them. And it quickly became apparent that it was better for me to speak English and let them know that I didn't understand Russian, because once they found out that I lived in Stahanov, I was part of Eastern Ukraine, I was met with a lot of distrust. And I would rely on a lot of the Peace Corps volunteers that had lived in the West to talk for me so that I could buy water or whatever it was that I needed from the store. And I remember another thing that was really obvious to me was some of the volunteers had invited all of us to stay later after the close of service conference was over. And I said, no, we have to get back for Miners Day. And one of the volunteers from the West said, like miners as in children? And I said, no, as in coal miners. Because coal mining day, which happens I think it was August, it was near the end of August, it was really close to Ukrainian Independence Day, actually. And we would, there was a huge celebration. The president of Ukraine at the time came to Stahanov. There's fireworks and concerts, and everybody celebrates coal mining because it was something that was very important during the Soviet Union. And in my town of Stahanov, the hammer and sickle symbol of communism and the Soviet Union is on everything, including the trash cans. It was just part of our culture on the east side was to, and some people would say, they wouldn't even say I'm Russian, they would say I'm Soviet. Usually the older people would say that they are part of the Soviet Union still, even though the Soviet Union had collapsed decades before. So it was a very interesting experience to view the 2 sides of the country, because they were very different at the time and they are now. But it was, what they all have in common is that they are very proud and fierce people that have a love of their culture, their families, and their their country, to be honest, whatever that country may be that they identify with, their oblast, their way of life. So this is a map of Ukraine. So Lugansk Oblast is over here. This is the Russian border. You have Belarus, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Moldova, Romania, and then the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea down here. So when I living in Lugansk, you can tell I was very close to Russia. I was about 50 kilometers from the border, if that gives you an idea of how close I was. In fact, at one point we were swimming in a river and realized we had swam to Russia accidentally. And quickly came back. So we were just very close. And in fact, I didn't celebrate Ukrainian Independence Day until I happened to be on the west side for Independence Day. I didn't even know when Independence Day was because nobody on the east side celebrated it. We celebrated Russian holidays. For example, my favorite holiday turned out to be Maslenitsa. Maslenitsa was celebrated, it's kind of like their version of Mardi Gras, the Russian version of Mardi Gras. So masla means butter. So it's like the last day you can eat eggs and butter and milk, like dairy, before the start of Lent. And so everybody would eat pancakes. And the weirdest tradition was that they would take the size of a power line pole and they would grease it. And then men would take off their shirts and their pants. They kept their boxers on and they would crawl up this greased pole. And if they reached the top, then they would get like free groceries for the day or something, like a prize. And it was just the oddest thing to see and the weirdest tradition. And and it was freezing because it was really, really cold and everybody's out there throwing snowballs at the poor guys trying to climb up the pole. Anyway, it was a very interesting experience. And of course, nobody on the west side knew what I was talking about when I talked about Maslenitsa, because again, it was you had very distinctive separation in language, holidays, traditions, and culture. So it's not, the current tension right now is not overly surprising, but I'm going to talk about the conflict in a bit. So the culture of Ukraine, Ukraine is a highly traditional country, and they have many customs and practices that play a central role in the culture. They have beautiful art and music and poetry and works of fiction. And I mean, you have to remember, Ukraine has been around since like 900 AD. So it's a very old country. I remember standing in a city that was 3,500 years old and just like that just blew my mind that I was in a city that old. And so there is a lot of traditions and a lot of customs that needed to be adhered to. In this blue church here, this was the Russian Orthodox Church in Stahanov. There are many beautiful churches in Ukraine. I chose this one because it was in my town. This statue here is in Kiev. It is of Taras Shevchenko. Taras Shevchenko was a poet that was very popular in the 19th century, and at the time when Ukraine was part of Russia. And but he is very Ukrainian. He was from Kiev, and he identified, as a Ukrainian nationalist, and his poetry is well loved to this day. In fact, that's a picture of my dad and I enjoying the culture. And looking forward is a very red university known as Shevchenko University. It is the largest university in Ukraine. And I had many students that ended up transferring to Shevchenko University after they were done at the community college with me. You've probably seen the beautiful painted eggs at Easter. There are the matryoshka, the stacking dolls. There's a lot of art that comes from Ukraine specifically that people aren't aware is very inherent to Ukraine. And just so you know, borscht, which is a Russian, almost don't call it a soup, by the way. It's like a stew, but even hardier than that. It's Ukrainian. It's not Russian. It's not Polish. It's Ukrainian. So that's another part of the culture that was really important. I learned how to make borscht. In fact, I think I still make it without really thinking about it. So it was a typical Sunday afternoon thing to make borscht for the week. In this picture, you can see my parents and my niece, and then you also see Mama Tanya and Toita Nina. This was my host family. The first 2.5 years I lived in Ukraine, I lived in Chernigiv. Oh, I forgot to show you where that was. This is Chernigiv Oblast. It's up here at the top of the country, and it's about a 90-minute drive from the capital of Kiev. And so Chernigiv was a mix of Russian-speaking people and Ukrainian-speaking, and even Sergic, which is a mix of both languages. And there's no way I could understand anybody when they spoke Sergic. So it was a more, I think it was probably a good introduction to Ukraine, because again, that was my first 2.5 months. And then when I went to Lugansk, where it was just, people would tell me I was in Ukraine or I was in Russia. So
before you go any further off the map, Jody was asking, and I'm really curious too, where the line is between East and West. And I'm wondering if the river is what creates that divide, as far as, especially that you're saying it's really the East is the Russian side. So is it just those you hear on the news, the two territories that are basically Russian dominant? Is it just those two territories, or are there more?
So Donetsk and Lugansk make up the Donbass region, and the Donbass region is as far east as you can get, and that is eastern Ukraine. Kharkiv, or Kharkiv, excuse me, is also an eastern oblast. Dnipropetrovsk is also is considered more central, eastern central. So it's really these three oblasts here, Kharkiv, Lugansk, and Donetsk, that are considered more eastern Ukraine. And I'm going to talk more about the Donbass region when I talk about the conflict.
Thanks a lot.
You're welcome. Any other questions about the map before I move on? Okay. So back to the culture. So Toita Nina, she was really more my babushka, but she didn't want to be a grandma, so she told me to call her Toita, which is auntie. And I learned a lot about Ukraine and the Soviet Union from her. I think it was the first time I ever heard somebody tell me that the Soviet Union was a good thing and that communism isn't bad. And I learned all of that from Toita Nina, sitting in her kitchen while she cooked, and she just talked at me in Russian, and I couldn't really talk to her, but I listened. And when my parents visited, I had lived in the country for 2 years at that point, and I didn't know how good my Russian had become until they came over and I had to translate everything for them. And I was like, oh, hey, look at me, I'm doing it. And I remember we were in Kiev and we took a bus to Chernigiv, and my parents wanted to eat breakfast. I said, no, we're not eating. And so I said, trust me. We get to Chernigiv, and then I made them walk 3 miles because I didn't realize anymore that 3 miles was a long walk. And my mom was ready to murder me because she was hungry and tired and sweaty. And I was like, trust me. So we get to the apartment, and Toita Nina has this giant spread of every inch of that table was covered with food. Borscht, vareniki, yapsandol, which is a dish from Georgia, because Toita Nina was Georgian. And so a lot of different types of foods. And my parents would clear their plate, and then Toita Nina would come and put more food on their plate. Food is an extremely important part of Ukrainian culture. And then my parents would eat the next, whatever she had served them, and then she'd do it again. The 4th time she did it, my parents looked at me horrified. They're like, what do we do? And so I had stopped eating already when I got full, and Toita Nina, said something to me, and I said, I'm not going to eat anymore. I'm done. And she's like, oh, Jessica. And she was used to me. And so I told my parents, I was like, just stop eating. And I told Toita Nina, my parents are full. And Toita Nina said, wow, clearly the Americans don't like my cooking if they can't even clear their plate. And I was cracking up, and I translated, and Tanya was laughing too because she spoke English. And my parents were like, oh my God, and they just started eating more. And I'm like, just stop. And so it was just Toitanina. And it was just, but it was very inherent to older populations of Ukraine where food was really important. And it was really important to them to be good hosts and hostesses and make sure that you were full. It was important to them that you did not leave their house hungry. And then of course, after all that, we had dessert, which is what you're seeing on that table. So it was, and that was always tea. Tea time is we had tea time 5 times a day. In fact, it was written into our, the class schedule, and said it wasn't called break, it was called tea time. And we would have like 30 minutes for tea time, the students and teachers alike. So it was the food, the language, the music, all is a huge part of Ukrainian culture. So I'm sharing this because it's a very good reminder that Kiev has been around a lot longer than Moscow, that Ukraine existed before Russia was a superpower, and Ukraine will continue to exist long after. Okay, now the conflict, what's going on? So the Soviet Republic, basically all of the countries that made up the Soviet Union all got their independence when the Soviet Union fell in 1991. Things remained relatively quiet in Ukraine as they were trying to build up their currency and their government until 2004, when a pro-Russian candidate was declared president. Allegations of vote rigging triggered protests and what's now known as the Orange Revolution. Amazon Prime has a movie about it if you want to watch it. The democracy was restored when the pro-Western former Prime Minister Viktor Yushchenko was then named the rightful winner. So again, a lot of the times in the presidential elections, you will have a pro-Russian candidate and a pro-European candidate. So the pro-European candidate was the one who wanted to have Ukraine as an independent country, uphold democracy, and have more ties with Western Europe. And the long-term goal was to become part of the European Union and NATO. The pro-Russian candidate was Putin's puppet and was only meant to cut Ukraine off from Western Europe and be more Russian centralized. Ukraine literally translates as the bridge. So Ukraine has been known as the bridge between Western Europe and Eastern Europe its entire existence. In 2008, NATO promised Ukraine it would one day join the alliance, but that never actually happened. 2 years later, in 2010, a pro-Russian president was elected, and that was Viktor Yanukovych. Yes, I was there. He was the one who was originally declared the winner in that 2004 election that triggered the Orange Revolution. He took office, and he was not a good president. He suspended trade with the European Union. He tried to cut as many ties with the EU as he could. And he did whatever Putin told him to do. He revised ties with Moscow. And so Ukraine went through a transition and I had just gotten there. Like the election happened, I think it was like 3 months after we'd been in country. And it wasn't, I just remember I was already in the East at that time. So people were pretty happy about it, but there were, a lot of angry people in the West and in the capital. And I only heard about that through emails or the rare occasion I saw a television. In 2014, after Yanukovych rejected the EU's offer to join, violent protests gripped the capital of Ukraine, and it is now known as the Euromaidan Revolution. Dozens of protesters were killed. In fact, February 20th marked the 8th anniversary of the Heavenly 100 Heroes Remembrance Day. My supervisor, when I was a Peace Corps volunteer, was a Ukrainian nationalist, and he worked for Peace Corps. He was part of the 100 that was murdered during that revolution. The revolution was essentially victorious in the sense that it did force a change in leadership. Yanukovych fled to Russia. back to Putin, and it you know, the country became a democracy again, in theory. But within days, and remember, this was all during the Sochi Olympics was going on at the time, and which Russia was hosting. Within days of the 2014 revolution, Russian insurgents seized Crimea and raised the Russian flag. Moscow and Putin annexed the territory and declared it part of Russia. My Russian teacher lived in Crimea, still lives in Crimea. And she told me over the phone that the day that Putin held his what's the word? I'm sorry. To the election day, the day that it was election day in Crimea to vote whether or not Crimea would be annexed officially into Russia. A Russian soldier held a gun to her head and said, "You will vote for annexation or I will shoot you." And that's how Putin's elections go. That is why Putin has been in power for as long as he has. And he claims it's a democracy, but really, is it a democracy when you have a gun literally held to your head? And so that is why so many Ukrainians voted yes for annexation, because they honestly had no choice. Also at the same time, Russian insurgents invaded my oblast of Lugansk and the one next to it, Donetsk, and that is known as the Donbass region. They declared their independence and have been at war with the Ukrainian army for the past 8 years. So while everything that's happening in Ukraine right now is a tragedy, and I'm grieving for the people that I know outside of my oblast, I have been grieving this war for the past 8 years, because my city, my home, my people, my students were threatened 8 years ago, and many people that I knew and loved have been murdered in the past 8 years. I still have students living in Stahanov during all of this, and as I go back to the conversation about two different Ukraines, the reason that they are still there and that they have been there for the past 8 years while the Russian insurgents have been there is that they view themselves as Russian. So it didn't, they were happy about being annexed, not officially annexed, but no longer, they never considered themselves Ukrainian. And I had one who emailed me today and said, well, why are you upset now? Why weren't you upset over the past 8 years when the Ukrainian army was bombing us? And it's such a different mentality. I've been upset for the past 8 years, but I was never upset at the Ukrainian army, but they are, because to them, it's the Ukrainian army that is the bad guy in this scenario. And it's the Russian insurgents that are there to save them. It's a lot of Russian propaganda, a lot of Putin's propaganda, and the way he spins stories and history. And the Russian government has been feeding its people propaganda probably since the dawn of time, honestly, but at least as long as I've been alive. So it's they believe what Putin is telling them, that the Ukrainians are the ones who want to harm them. So they declared their independence officially, and it was the Donbass region that Putin recognized as being independent from Ukraine just this past week. And of course, it was all, again, he was the one who was funding them with tanks and weapons and food. So while he would say, oh, they're not Russian soldiers, they were Russian insurgents that were funded by the Russian government. In 2019, a missile brought down a passenger plane in eastern Ukraine, killing all 219 people. And the weapons were traced back to Russia, but to this day, Russia denies any involvement, but they deny a lot of things that they are responsible for. In January 2021, Ukrainian President Zelensky asked Biden to make Ukraine a NATO alliance to join, so that Ukraine could join. In response, Russian troops began massing near Ukraine's border that spring. Biden warned Russia of sweeping economic sanctions in December if they advanced. And now that brings us to the current situation. For weeks, there have been warnings of an invasion, Russian denials, and threats of sanctions. Now we know that the aggression is reality. The Russian denials a flagrant lie. The sanctions are reality. More tougher sanctions on the horizon are meant to financially strangle Putin and Russia. If anybody watched Biden's speech yesterday, America and its allies have already cut off the banks and a lot of the financial means for Russians. The ruble is at the lowest it's ever been in history. 22 billionaires lost. I think I read this morning it was $39 billion overnight. The Russian people are definitely feeling the noose around their necks already. So the sanctions are working right now, but it will only get worse. The only thing I dislike about sanctions is that it hurts the people more than it does the government. So, and I would like to say that there were protests in Moscow and St. Petersburg yesterday of Russians who do not want this war, that they recognize that Ukraine is not their enemy. In fact, many of them have family in Ukraine. Many of them are former Ukrainians that have moved to Russia, and they still have family. I know many of them who, I was talking to a friend today. He's in Russia and his mom is in Kiev, and he can't seem to help get her out. And he's trying to help her leave the country, and it's proving to be impossible right now. And this is the reality of war. And I think that things that Ukrainians want you to know. First off, this war is not new. This war has been going on since 2014. The only thing new is that Russia has moved further in and is now taking the entire country of Ukraine. Whereas nobody thought that would happen, by the way. Everybody thought that he would just take the East. Nobody really expected him to take the entire country. And nobody in Ukraine thought that would actually happen. And it's happened. I just spoke to a friend who I had known. She was a foreign exchange student when I was in high school. So I've known her since I was 15 years old. And then when I came to Ukraine, I spent time with her and her family. She's in the West with her parents and her children, and her husband was in Kharkiv with his family to try to help his parents leave. And her husband was killed last night. I talked to her this morning. So people that I know, people that I love, people that I care about are dying. They have been dying for 8 years. And that's what people want you to realize. I had a student who was really angry. She says, I don't understand what's wrong with Americans, that they just now seem to know that we've been at war for 8 years. So I think it was definitely in the news in 2014 eventually, but I think people grew numb because it was over there. It didn't affect me. It's over there. It's like Afghanistan and Iraq. It's over there. It doesn't affect me. But it has affected me and the 499 other volunteers that were there when I was there, and to the many others, that the thousands of Peace Corps volunteers that have served at the time. So to us, this is a tragedy in a horrific and traumatic way, because people we know are dying. This is right now, and I know the media has been saying this is the largest invasion in Europe since World War II. The end game for Putin is that he did not want Ukraine to become part of the European Union or NATO. And he even said, I will get out of the country as long as you promise that Ukraine will never be part of NATO. Of course, this was something he said before he had launched his attack on the entire country. So it's hard to believe him, but it is one of his biggest fears. And it was when I lived there. So that's always been his fear. So this map shows you how the Russians have completely surrounded Ukraine. The only country it hasn't used as a port of entry is Poland, because Poland is a NATO country. And if they invade it, the allies have made it very clear that they will retaliate. Moldova, I guarantee you, had no choice but to let the Russian troops in. They're too small to fight them. And so they came up through Crimea, through the east. Belarus, the same thing. Belarus has a president that is under Putin's control as well. So they don't really have a lot of allies in that area. So you can see Lugansk and Donetsk. This is the area. So the capital of Lugansk and then the capital of Donetsk. It was always part of the Russian insurgent separatist area, and now the rest of the east is being attacked as well. So while these images are horrifying, I think it's also important to understand that these are people. And that was, if you take anything from this presentation today, I hope that you take the fact that Ukraine is not over there, that these are people that we know, that we care about. And I think the hard thing for a lot of Peace Corps volunteers like myself is that I was there for 2.5 years and all the work that I did was undone, almost like that. The people that I care about are threatened. The place that I called home doesn't exist anymore. There is a Facebook group now of returned Peace Corps volunteers, and it's full of how do I help my people? How do I help my people get to Poland? What do we do? Are the trains running? Where do we donate? What can we do? What do I do to help? It's what we want to do. Educating all of you is a small thing, but it really feels like the only thing I can physically do right now. Putin, his end goal, Putin has never seen Ukraine as separate and country. He always has said it's a state of Russia. And that's how he views all the former Soviet countries. He has made that very clear on multiple occasions, at least over the past 12 years that I've been paying attention. And he said that his dream was one day to recreate the Soviet Union and to get all of those countries back. So some people said, well, he's acting irrationally right now. He's being irrational. Look what he's just done to Russia's image. Now nobody will ever do business with Russia as long as Putin's in power. But is he being irrational? Because that's irrational if you have a post-colonialism mentality. He does not have that post mentality. He still has that colonialism, colonizer mentality. And that is what he's doing to Ukraine. He's taking Ukraine because he believes it's his to take. Will he do that to the other former countries? I don't know. Ukraine is is the second largest country in Eastern Eastern Europe. It's even bigger than Poland. It has enough agriculture to feed 600 million people. It is known as the breadbasket of Europe. It has a thriving industry. It has the black soil, which is known as basically the soil of gold because it can grow anything. Ukraine is valuable. Ukraine is valuable to Russia. Ukraine is valuable to Europe, which is why they've been fighting over it for centuries. Putin has chosen a premeditated war that will bring a catastrophic loss of life and human suffering. The world will hold Russia accountable. Biden said that yesterday. This is a declaration of war against the whole of Europe, according to Ukrainian President Zelensky. He wrote that on Twitter. Zelensky is begging America and European powers to intervene and to help and to do something to save Ukrainians in any way that they can. I know that I'm sure Zelensky would be thrilled if military powers came in and actually helped his country. But I'm sure he understands from a diplomatic point that I don't see that happening. It didn't happen 8 years ago, and I don't see it happening now. The Ukrainian people are unfortunately on their own. And they are doing well, by the way. Don't count them out. They're actually, I checked this morning, they won many victories yesterday, and they were able to hold the Russian soldiers back. They have captured many Russian soldiers. but this is very much war, and they're fighting a very big dragon. And I don't know how long they will be able to hold out in the long run. How can you help? First and foremost, disinformation is part of Russian war. Propaganda is part of Putin's bread and butter. So please look for reliable and fact-checked news. KievPost.com. You can also follow them on Facebook. It is the only English speaking or English written newspaper in Ukraine, and a reliable source. The Euromaidan, Maydon, Facebook page is another way that you can follow actual news as to what's going on in Ukraine from Ukrainians themselves. When you post, please use correct wording. Russian troops in Ukraine are not peacekeepers, they are invaders. The so-called Lugansk Donetsk Republic in Eastern Ukraine are not self-declared republics or breakaway regions. They are the Russian puppet republics. The occupying forces are not Russia-backed separatists or rebels. They are Russian-formed, led, and financed proxy forces. Share as much fact-based information about Russian aggression as you can. Do not post any information about the movement of Ukraine's armed forces. Reach out to your representatives, and this is what I'm going to ask all of you to do. Please reach out to your representatives and urge them to support sanctions against the Russian Federation. I emailed Newman yesterday, and Patty Murray and Maria Cantwell. I emailed our representatives, and I said, this is what I'm asking for you to do, is to have the highest possible sanctions possible. I'm not asking for them to advocate war. I'm not that naive, but I am asking them to do everything that America possibly can. Here, joining or organizing in a rally in support of Ukraine in your city is helpful. I don't think we have any here in Moses Lake, but I know that a lot popped up in Seattle and Portland and Olympia yesterday. They're everywhere. And I think as educators, it's important to educate our students about the facts about what's going on, and help them understand that these are real people. These are their lives, and citizens are dying. This is not something that it's just the military bases. It's the military bases and the airports and residential apartment buildings and hospitals and schools. I remember in 2014 seeing an image of a bomb that was dropped on the kindergarten in Stahanov, and the teachers that I knew died there with their 5-year-old students. So this war is awful, and so many people have already died.
Jess,
Yep.
could I just ask a question from the chat? Ann Ganazi brought it up. Why hasn't Ukraine been able to join NATO? Could you talk about that, please?
That's a political maneuver that I unfortunately don't know all the ins and outs of. I know that Ukraine has wanted to be a part of NATO since, like I said, since 2008, and NATO has promised that it would happen. The fear is that once they accept Ukraine as part of NATO, that Russia would invade, and then not only Ukraine, but other NATO countries. And NATO is like, well, since Ukraine is a hot topic, a hot button for Putin, if we add Ukraine and then he invades, then we all have to get involved. Like Biden said yesterday, we're not going to help Ukraine. We're only going to help our NATO allies. So if Ukraine had become a NATO ally, then they would have to help. So it really does come down to NATO, which I'm sure they have made it very clear that they would love to have a military base in Ukraine and make it that much closer to Russia. Putin's made it very clear he doesn't want that to happen. And so they were worried that if they set up NATO in Ukraine, then it would trigger Putin to invade Ukraine. Well, now he's invaded Ukraine regardless. So that fear that they had in 2008 no longer applies to the current situation. So there you go. There's the political history behind that. That's unfortunately all I know. If there's more incentives, I don't know. Good question though. So if you would like to help, this is what Ukrainians are asking. In fact, many Ukrainians are asking the Come Back Alive if you would like to donate financially, I'm not asking you to give away your money, but if you feel like helping, this is a great way to do that. It's an NGO and it works with making the lives of Ukrainian soldiers more comfortable. It does not provide weapons. It just provides clothing and food and other things that will make the soldiers' lives more comfortable and safe. So this one is the one that in that group I told you about that I have heard more and more about. Like Come Back Alive is the resource that every Ukrainian is sharing. And so if you want to help financially, that would be one that you can. If you want to take a screenshot or take a picture with your phone real quick of all of these resources, then I recommend doing that because all of these are reliable and credible places where you can donate financially if it's something that you are wishing to do. Another thing you can do if you have a Twitter account, you can follow Christopher Miller on Twitter. He is a returned Peace Corps volunteer from Group 38, so the group right after mine. And I knew Chris, he and I served in Eastern Ukraine together. He was also the editor of the Kyiv Post for a while after we left Peace Corps. And now he is a journalist and editor for BuzzFeed, which I know has its own, like BuzzFeed isn't the most reliable news source, but I can tell you Chris is. So Chris is in Ukraine right now. He is in Kiev and he is giving up-to-date information that's exactly what's going on. And I trust Chris implicitly. So I would recommend him as a source. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing this. And a lot of chats. So I'm more than happy to answer whatever you might, any questions that you might have. Go ahead and shout them out.
Jess, we have a sizable Ukrainian community here in the area, don't we?
Yes.
Do you have a sense of where in Ukraine they come from predominantly, or are all over?
From the people I've talked to, predominantly all over. Of course, you know, as you all know, Soap Lake has a very large Ukrainian Russian population, and so does Moses Lake. But I've talked to people who, many of them, for example, we have people who work in Beta who their families came from St. Petersburg. So some people are coming from Russia. Some people, I know some people who are coming from Odessa. Some people are coming from Lviv, which is in the western part. I've never talked to anybody who's been in the eastern part, but I do notice that when I say where I lived, many of them go, ooh, because of the conflict that has been going on for the past 8 years. But
Okay.
yeah, they're all over the map when it comes to Eastern Europe.
So do they speak a mix of Ukrainian and Russian?
Most of the people that I've talked to speak Russian, but there have been a couple students who can speak both, or at least come from a household where they speak both. Most of them say though that their families speak Russian. So a lot of the Ukrainians, I found this out, a lot of the reason why we have such a large Ukrainian population in this area of Washington State, which random, is because Moses Lake and Soap Lake became refugee cities after the fall of the Soviet Union. So a lot of Ukrainians and Russians ended up immigrating to this area in 1991 when the Soviet Union fell. So I didn't know that when I moved here. I just thought that was a really interesting tidbit in case nobody knew that. Good question. So Matthias, didn't you say that the school was going to create a database for instructors and students?
What I was thinking about doing was creating a library research guide with featuring relevant books that we have and other showcasing sources that are out there on the web as well.
I think that's great. And I think that's a great idea. I will tell you, I know you emailed me last night asking for resources and I told you about the Kyiv Post. I've just found out though this morning that the infrastructure in Ukraine is already being hit hard when it comes to being able to post.
That's
So
not surprising.
Yeah,
cyber
it's not
attacks.
surprising.
Yeah.
It may be very soon where we won't be able to get any news out of Ukraine at all, which is why I tried to share Chris's Twitter. If that's something that if he ends up leaving, he might be able to post more or other. But yeah, it's about to be a media blackout here pretty soon.
Mhm.
Do we happen to know if I mean, I haven't looked at the news. Maybe I should look in the news, but I've been here. Is the president still alive?
The president is still alive. President Zelensky is still alive. He is in charge of the military. He is sending troops. He made that very clear yesterday that they have they voted to go into martial law on February 22nd. I think it was the 22nd or early morning on the 23rd. So before all the bombs started, they had already gone into martial law. And Zelensky and his parliament are now in Lviv in the west. They are, as far as I know, relatively safe. They are not going to leave Ukraine. They've made that very clear that they will not leave Ukraine. Zelensky's a proud man. I wouldn't be surprised that I don't think he'll leave unless he dies. Honestly, I don't think that. I know that the end goal is to put in a Russian sympathizer president so that Putin can control Ukraine. I think Zelensky will stay there until his last breath, to be honest. Yeah, that is true, Linda. All males 16 to 60. Part of the President Zelensky has mandated that all men 16 through 60 have to stay within the Ukrainian borders and fight for the Ukrainian army. So it was a very wide sweeping draft. I just spoke with a couple of my students, Alex, and he is currently in Kiev with his dog from Stahanov. By the way, he was excited to show me a picture of his dog because my cat comes from there, and he remembers my cat. So this is Alex. I don't know if you guys can see Alex and his dog. This is them in a bunker in Kiev last night. And I see that I have 7 more messages from him this morning. So it's lots of messages. My phone has been very active with messages from them. Some of them just needing to express how they feel. And I tried to convey that in my conversation with all of you today. But to answer your question, Barb, yes, Zelensky is still in charge of the military, and they are still fighting back. Any other questions I can answer?
I wanted to ask another question about the languages.
Mhm.
I know that the two are very closely related, but you speak of them as though they're not mutually intelligible. Is that right?
No.
Okay.
Ukrainian has other characters, has extra characters that I couldn't even begin to tell you what sound they make. So it's a Slavic language, of course, in case anybody didn't know that. So Ukrainian has extra characters in it, and a lot of the sounds for a Russian character is a different sound. Even though they look exactly the same, it'd be a different sound in Ukrainian. So although they're both Slavic languages, they are as different as night and day, and it's very hard to. I remember being very arrogant, like I'm going to learn both of them. I quickly learned that was not going to happen. So I can Russian, no problem, but Ukrainian, I feel very ignorant when it comes to trying to speak or read Ukrainian.
So they might be roughly as similar as, say, Dutch and English. Is that possible?
Yeah, I mean, yes. I do feel like, well, of course, I'd have to look at the Ukrainians and Russians can communicate with each other, but not well. You know what I mean? Like if somebody's speaking Ukrainian and somebody's speaking Russian and they can understand, it'd be like me trying to speak Spanish with somebody who is a Spanish English speaker. Whereas I can understand them, but I'm maybe not communicating back really well. And so I'll fall back into English. It's kind of like, it's a very awkward exchange to watch. Okay. And the languages are very political. But Ukrainians have said that there's no, if you speak Russian most Ukrainians are not going to judge you. It depends on how far west you've gone. I was way far. I was almost in Poland, and that they have a very specific view of Russian-speaking Ukrainians. But Russian-speaking Ukrainians are not subjugated. They're not hated on just because that they speak Russian. It's that's a lot of propaganda itself. But the languages are very political, and the language has always been political. And I think that, and it's why I advocate that America never have a national language, because I see what declaring a national language in a country does to that country. I've seen that in multiple countries. Oh, good. Jen's agreeing with me. The language teacher's agreeing with me. Barb, did you have a question?
No, I was going to back up with what Linda, she said maybe we should have our languages both in our translations, both in Ukrainian and Russian, but also what is it being, do you know if there's anything being done in Grant County to support Ukrainian families here?
As far as I know right now, no, I haven't. I mean, obviously this is relatively new. So I haven't seen anything online. I haven't seen anything out in the community yet. But that's a really good point. It would be something that I would like to explore. And if I find about anything, I will email I'll email all the faculty and let you guys know what's going on. I did talk to one person since this all started happening, who is from a Ukrainian family. And I said, are you guys talking about what's going on? And he shook his head. He said, we don't have family there anymore. And therefore it doesn't really affect us. So it really does come down. It depends on who has family there. I have a friend who married a Ukrainian man when we were Peace Corps volunteers, and they live in Virginia now. And she was saying that she was trying to send money to her in-laws. Western Union was working yesterday. Don't know if it's working today. They were able to send money to their in-laws, and everybody was at the ATM. That's what every Ukrainian was at an ATM trying to get money out, trying to flee to Poland. I told you guys about my friend whose mom is stuck in Kiev. One of the reasons she hasn't left because she's worried about her retirement money. Like, how will she get her retirement money? And it's hard to imagine, I want to be like, your retirement money, you're not going to get your retirement money regardless. But when, you're a 70-year-old woman who's alone and has nothing but her little dog, I get why she's scared to go out into a war zone. So I don't know. I didn't know what to say. I'm not the one talking to her directly. I'm talking to her son, but he's like, I don't know how to convince her to take this seriously, that she needs to get out. So a lot of people are still in the denial stage of grief.
One of the things I was wondering, I have several neighbors that are Ukrainian, is that they're highly connected to their churches, and wondering if a way to connect with Ukrainian people would be through some of the Ukrainian churches in town. I mean, they have shut all their blinds and they are closing off everything, which has been an interesting observation. And they have 8 kids. I haven't seen any of their kids outside playing or doing anything else. So I do believe it's highly affecting them. I haven't gone over yet, but I am going to today to just let them know I'm thinking of them. Yeah,
that's great. I think that reaching out, if you know people of Ukrainian descent here personally, I would recommend reaching out. Send a text, send an email. They're probably very bombarded right now with phone calls and trying to get in touch with their loved ones. I think working through the churches is a great idea. That's enough. The church is also very political. So people in Western Ukraine, there are so many churches of different faiths, of like what you would expect in any country, honestly. But then in Eastern Ukraine, there were hardly any churches. There was one Baptist church, which I always thought was super random. And then there was of course a couple, the Russian Orthodox Church. But religion is is not a part of communism, and a lot of people consider themselves communists or former Soviets. So it just kind of depends on where in the country they are, if religion is important to them, where they came from. Somebody had asked about, I'm sorry, I know you guys are dropping questions in the chat.
Russian propaganda, like how how much past it do they, I noted you saw that.
Yeah.
Yeah, like how much past that are Ukrainians able to see? Can they tell that it's propaganda? Like, oh, that's propaganda.
No, unfortunately, no. I mean, it's kind of like, I mean, think about fake news in America and vaccine misinformation. How many Americans believe vaccine misinformation because of propaganda? Okay, it's the same thing, guys. It's you have some Ukrainians who believe in the Russian propaganda, and then you have some who don't. It's a politically divided country, much like our own. So, sorry, are there other questions? Steve, is there anything that I may have missed that you would like to chime in on?
Nothing I can think of. No, I lived in Kiev for 2 years, so I was more over toward the western side of the country. And hang on just a second. Isn't it amazing how the Roomba can always find you when you start talking? So yeah, I experienced a lot of the same thing. Kiev is mostly Russian speaking, but Kiev also is very, very nationalistic. So they will talk about the things that happened under the Soviet Union. And I mentioned a couple of them in the chats. So for example, the national symbol of Ukraine is the trident. And under the Soviet Union, you could actually be jailed if you were found to have a trident in your home. So there was a huge suppression of Ukrainian values. And it looks like what's going on right now is Putin is trying to establish that again. He's modeling what he's doing after what Stalin did. And it's a big deal. I don't know where it's going. I'm really, really frightened for where it's going. I still have friends in Ukraine, you know, and so does my wife, so does my ex-wife. So it's really, I don't know, it's very shocking, and it makes it very hard to work to know what's going on right now. And I know, you know, for everybody, not just people who are connected to Ukraine, but for people who are watching this, it's really difficult. It's like, don't we have enough disasters already without something like this going on? Ukraine is a very strong country, very strong people, and they're also a very resilient people. So things like this have happened within Ukraine before, and Ukraine recovers, but they need help. And whatever we can do, for me, it's fighting the disinformation. So some of the disinformation you'll hear is things like, and part of this comes from Putin, aligning Ukrainian values with Nazi values, which is absolutely insane. I've been to Babi Yar, which is a place in Kiev where there was an assassination of a huge group of Ukrainians by the Nazis. They are violently anti-Nazi in Kiev. And this is all based on one group called the Azov. I forget, it's a militia group. Mm-hmm. It's basically like judging America's entire military on one proto-fascist or neo-Nazi group. So I would say, as much as you can, watch for the misinformation, watch for the lies, and they are coming from inside of the United States, from well-known commentators, and you can probably guess who. But when people spread it around, shoot it down. Tell them, no, that's not true. Because this is one of the first things that I think goes on is dehumanization, where if we can say they don't really count as people, or they don't really count as Ukrainians, they're really Russians. If we stop distinguishing between them, then we stop caring about what's going on there. And it's incredibly important to care because this is, I mean, it's a first step in something that Putin has planned. And the man is a megalomaniac. And he's aligned with other megalomaniacs. Who's the leader in Belarus?
I was trying to think of his name too. I'm
out there too. He's, yeah, so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Isn't it Lukashenko?
Lukashenko.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I've been to Belarus as well. And in Belarus, when we went into Belarus, we were warned, do not say anything against the government, even though you're American citizens. They will put you in jail. So, and in Russia, I don't know if you follow this, but in Russia, they've jailed, I think, over 1,600 people for protesting against the war.
Yes, they have.
And so there, even within Russia, it's not the people of Russia who want this to happen. It's Putin who wants this to happen.
Yeah, I want to reiterate that, Steve. It's not the Russian people, it's Putin and his government. And I think that's really important to remember so that we don't have World War II-like conflicts, but just because you're German or just because you're Japanese, I'm going to automatically distrust you. It's not the Russian people, it's Putin and his government.
But yeah, that's all I had, Jess. And that was really, really very informative. And yeah, thanks for hosting this.
Thanks, Steve. I
really
was
helpful.
all Lindsay. I just am talking. Lindsay organized it. Is there, yeah, I just wanted to say that I appreciate this opportunity to share this information with all of you. If anything comes up, and I imagine a lot of things are going to come up over the next days, weeks, months, I'm more than happy to continue this conversation, to do the best I can. That a lot of the information I'm getting is coming directly from the people in the country itself. I'm not relying upon US media because I honestly feel like they're not completely factual. Something that's really, I did have the news on yesterday, and I got really annoyed with the talking heads when they were talking about how this is Biden's fault, or it's Trump's fault, or it's, it's Canada's fault, or it's Britain's fault, or no, it's Putin's fault. Like, let's put blame where blame is due. Now, do all the other leaders have some form of, have they had some form of stake in this game? Yes, absolutely. And that's, unfortunately, that's politics. But I think it's really important to remember not to make this about ourselves, not to make this about a Trump thing or a Biden thing, but to remember that this is Putin invading a sovereign democratic country. And it's important that we show our support to the Ukrainian people and do everything we can to support the Ukrainian people. And I hope I gave you guys enough resources to show you how to do that. Any other questions?
Well,
Okay.
thank you so much, Jess. I'll make sure that the recording for this gets disseminated, however we're going to end up doing that. And thank you everyone for being here and for your time and attention today. And let's thank Jess one more time for her experience and energies.
Thank you, everybody. And thank you to the people that were here to listen today. Wishing you all the best.
Yeah, be well, everyone.
Be well. Bye.
Thanks, Lindsay.